Nancy got back to the table just as their coffee arrived. She stirred milk into her cup and sipped it, but then noticed Stark was watching and quickly added sugar. In truth, she hated it that way, but she had to stay vigilant. Stark was the most paranoid man she knew, and he knew Nancy's eating habits all too well. "Most girls have a weakness for sweets," Stark remarked with a sly grin. "There are desserts over there. Why don't you go pick one out?" Nancy smiled politely. "I'm still full from lunch, but thank you." Steve chimed in. "Go on. You deserve a treat after your big day." "If you insist." As Nancy got up from the table, she cursed Steve under her breath. Why was that the first time he decided to be nice to her? Nancy took the first thing she saw, a tiramisu, but just as Steve was stepping forward to pay for it, Jonathan swooped in. He ordered a full box of cakes and paid for Nancy's as well. Nancy watched as Steve reluctantly withdrew his wallet and silently steamed over being emasculated by Jonathan. The three of them returned to their seats, and Jonathan offered cake to Stark, but he declined. He pretended to not be hungry, but Nancy knew the truth. So deep was his paranoia that he would never eat food he hadn't purchased or prepared himself. Jonathan sampled a piece of cake, then turned to Nancy, offering her a bite off his fork. "Give it a try, Maria. I think you'll like it." He glanced at Steve, who watched Jonathan's flagrant display of intimacy without flinching. Nancy let Jonathan feed her, and her face lit up with delight as she chewed. "Oh my God, I've never pegged you for a dessert lover, Mr. Davis." Jonathan shrugged. "I have the strangest little cat at home who loves this stuff." Steve furrowed his brow in confusion, and Stark chimed in. "Mr. Davis, it sounds like your cat is living the life." Jonathan nodded. "Pampered beyond belief. She can still be temperamental, though. No matter how much I give her, she'll still always try to run off." Under the table, Nancy felt Jonathan's hand tickle her leg, so she knew he was talking about her. She quickly pulled away. Stark chuckled, and Nancy saw a flash of recognition in his eyes. His tone was suddenly more direct. "I've never owned a pet, but this cat of yours sounds like quite the companion. Maybe I'll have to get one myself." Jonathan feigned regret. "I'm afraid my little cat is one of a kind, and I simply cannot bear to part with her. Maybe you'd be happier with, I don't know, a lapdog?" Nancy despised being the object of a tug-of-war between these two men, but she marveled at Jonathan's brazenness. He could assert his dominance, even while holding a forkful of cake. Stark laughed, unfazed. "Jonathan, I do love your abstract sense of humor. I invited my young friend for coffee to discuss her joining the Franklin group, but it would seem that Steve here has already locked her up, so to speak." Nancy tensed at his language, but forced herself to remain calm. Steve replied before Jonathan could. "After she graduates, she'll be joining us at the Davis group." "I understand." Stark took a long sip of coffee and flashed a charismatic smile. "You know I admire you two a great deal. The Davis group was falling behind before you took over, and I'm personally of the opinion that competition makes us all stronger. In the spirit of friendship, perhaps Maria might come visit the Franklin group one day." "Absolutely," Jonathan agreed. "I'll escort her to Houston myself." Relieved that the conversation had finally turned to business, Nancy saw her opportunity to jump in. "I've heard your autonomous driving technology is unrivaled anywhere. I'm eager to see these revolutionary self-driving cars in the flesh." Stark grinned. "That hardware is our crown jewel. The car has undergone rigorous testing for nearly half a year, and when it hits the market, it's going to change everything." Nancy kept pushing. "It's late next month, right?" "You know your stuff. The first model will hit the road on the 21st, my late fiancé's birthday." His eyes glistened with nostalgia. Nancy's hand clenched into fists. She gripped her coffee with white knuckles, fighting the urge to throw it in his face. She fantasized about scalding his skin and leaving him scarred like Amelia had done to her. Instead, she bit her lip. "Mr. Green, can I ask you a personal question?" Stark leaned back confidently. "Ask away." "Doesn't that make your girlfriend jealous?" Her eyes sparkled with mischief, and Jonathan clocked in. Stark laughed. "Amelia understands that my late fiancé will always hold an important place in my heart. After all, it is she who inspired me to create this car in the first place." Jonathan felt a sudden pang of discomfort, but quickly masked his emotions. "You're clearly a man of unwavering loyalty." Nancy agreed through clenched teeth. "Clearly." Before long, Stark received a call from Amelia and excused himself. As the three exited the coffee shop, Steve turned to Nancy. "Where are you headed?" "Back to school." Steve reached for his car keys as if to offer her a ride, but she suddenly locked eyes with Jonathan behind him. "Thanks, but I'm supposed to meet my teammates back at the arena. I'll just go with them." Steve's face soured. "Suit yourself." He waved to Jonathan, then strode away with his lips pursed. Nancy wasn't sure what Jonathan's look had meant, so she kept up appearances and walked back toward the arena. As she rounded a corner, a car pulled up right in front of her. Jonathan rolled down the window. "Get in." As she climbed in next to Jonathan, Jack turned and smiled. "Hey, Maria. Congratulations." "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without Norman." Jack laughed as Nancy turned to Jonathan. "Where are we going?" "To the hospital. Olivia has been staying at Latham's place, but she fainted this morning and is back in the ICU." Shocked, Nancy agreed with a silent nod. As they drove to the hospital, Nancy's phone suddenly chimed with a notification. An email from Esther's mother read, "I did the DNA test, and you won't believe it. That girl is my daughter. Where is she? How can I get in touch with her?" Nancy's heart raced. She fought to control her expression as excitement coursed through her. She quickly typed a response. "She's in New York City, and according to the records, she was born and raised here. Do you have any idea how this could have happened?" Esther's mother had clearly been waiting because her reply was almost instantaneous. "I checked her DNA against my husband's as well, and it's a 100% match. I'm speechless. I have a copy of my ultrasound image right here, and there's only one baby in it." 2 minutes later, another email appeared. "Oh my God, it just hit me. When I was pregnant, my doctor was quite young, and after I gave birth, she tried to seduce my husband. We chased her away, but if she was set on stealing him from me, do you think she could have tricked me with a fake ultrasound? Even if she did steal my baby, how did she end up with a different family in New York?" Nancy was stumped, but there was one more Esther's mom needed to know. "There's something else, Mrs. Williams. Your daughter is in the hospital, and she's badly ill. If you want to see her, you should come as quickly as possible. But remember, she's a dead ringer for Esther, so you'll have to be discreet. I'll update you with a good time, so check your email often." Esther's mom agreed. "I'll do anything to see her, even if it's from a distance. Thank you for everything." As Nancy read the last email, she glanced up and noticed Jonathan gazing at her intensely. She was so engrossed, she hadn't thought about how bad it could be if he saw what she was writing. She put on an accusatory smirk to avoid suspicion. "Read anything good lately?" "Apparently you did. Who were you messaging that had you in such a trance?" She blinked. "You really didn't see." "Of course not. We need to respect each other's space. I would never go through your phone without permission." "Well, aren't you mature?" She jabbed him with her elbow, and he squeezed her tighter. "That's just one of the many things I can teach you." As he uttered the last words, his tongue deliberately grazed Nancy's ear. A shiver shot down her spine, and she inhaled sharply. "What kind of teacher does that?" His hands roamed her back. "The kind with obedient students." With that, he slipped his hand beneath her clothes. "If you don't stop, I'll slap you." Don't threaten me with a good time. In the driver's seat, Jack hummed a tune and raised the divider. Jonathan continued kissing her neck, but she soon pulled away and looked at him with tear-filled eyes. Do you think Olivia is going to die? Jonathan replied gravely. It comes for all of us sooner or later. Life, illness, death, they're all just part of being human. Nancy suddenly realized that no one could truly ever understand what she had experienced, and it made her feel terribly alone. Ever since she'd been reborn, death seemed to follow her wherever she went. Jonathan noticed her distant gaze and turned her chin to look at him. Maria, I'm serious. If something happens to me, promise you won't mourn for too long. His voice was eerily calm, as if discussing what they were going to eat for dinner. If I'm poisoned, if my head is blown off, if I drop the second I blow out my 32 birthday candles, just move on. At least I lived a full life. Nancy frowned. How can you be so morbid? He stared intensely into her eyes. It's not morbid. It's life. There are too many uncertainties in this world. I'm telling you now, so you'll remember. Nancy pouted, exasperated. I've never known anyone so healthy that talks about their own death so much. Jonathan smirked. Does it make your heart ache? Aha! She turned her face away, indignant. What makes you think I care? You could die tomorrow, and I'd be… She wanted to say fine, but the word caught in her throat. It was too awful to say. Devastated, I know. You just can't bear to be without me. With a smug grin, he grabbed Nancy's neck and kissed her passionately. When Nancy and Jonathan arrived at the hospital, they found Latham and Hannah sitting vigil by Olivia's bed. Nancy was shocked to see Latham's condition. In mere weeks, he lost at least 15 pounds. His eyes were shadowed by dark circles, and his once bright, excitable demeanor had faded to weariness. Beside him, Hannah struggled to peel an apple, and he laughed at her. Hannah, honey, you'll never find a husband if you can't even peel an apple. Hannah shot him a glare. Remember, I'm the one holding the knife. Nancy looked at Olivia laying on the bed. She was hooked up to an IV and oxygen, as well as a host of monitors. She looked even more frail than the last time they'd seen her, and Nancy was struck by the image of someone wasting away in front of them. Her heart ached knowing she was Esther's sister, and they'd almost certainly never get to meet each other. Latham, who'd been silently gazing at Olivia, suddenly stood. I want us to get married. There was a beat of silence as everyone recovered from the shock. Hannah spoke first. Latham, are you sure? Didn't she take all of her ex's debt in the divorce? I don't care. It's what we should have done years ago, and I can't unmake my choices in the past, but I can start making better ones now. I'll propose to her when she wakes up. Jonathan, can you? Jonathan held up his hand as he raised his phone to his ear. I'm already on it. Then he spoke into his phone. This is Jonathan Davis. I need you to be ready to host a wedding by this time next week. Hearing Latham's proposal, Nancy looked down at Olivia, and her heart soared. Suddenly, she had an idea. Do you think she'll want bridesmaids? I'd love to help out. Latham nodded approvingly. Perfect. It'll be you and Hannah. Hannah finally finished peeling the apple and stood up. I'll take care of the wedding dress and all the attire. I have something that will look perfect on her. Just then, Olivia stirred awake. She glanced around and seemed to sense that something had changed. She played innocent and flashed a smile. I wish Latham had told me there was a party. I would have worn my fancy hospital gown. Hannah handed her an apple slice, skewered on a toothpick, and Latham grinned, his earlier melancholy suddenly replaced by warmth. When they heard the good news, they couldn't resist coming to celebrate my love. Olivia looked around. What good news? Oh my God, am I cured? Everyone hesitated, and Olivia threw up her arms. Oh, come on. If you don't all laugh, it's just sad. Latham got down on one knee, and took Olivia's hand. Olivia? Well, she immediately cut him off. Yes. Oh my God, yes. They kissed passionately, and for a brief moment, Olivia's tragic fate seemed to be forgotten. The next morning, Nancy corresponded with Mrs. Williams to arrange a time for her to see Olivia. When Latham was called away to fill out paperwork at the marriage bureau, she saw an opportunity to arrange the meeting. A few minutes later, Nancy and Olivia were chatting when Olivia noticed someone at the door. Nancy looked up and recognized Esther's mother immediately. Mrs. Williams looked heartbroken, so Olivia spoke first. Ma'am, are you looking for someone? She opened her mouth as if to speak, but she couldn't seem to find words. Are you sick? Should I call someone? No, she finally choked out. I just saw you and couldn't help but think of my daughter. Olivia smiled warmly and invited her in. Don't be sad. Come have a seat and tell me about her. Mrs. Williams approached and hesitated before asking, You two look so alike. May I hug you? Olivia opened her arms, and Mrs. Williams embraced her daughter for the first time. Tears streamed down her face. Nancy's heart swelled with sorrow, and she excused herself to give them time alone. Leaning against the wall outside, she was trying to compose herself when her phone suddenly rang. It was a FaceTime call from her older sister, Angela. Angie, how are you? I'm on a business trip. Angela's voice was filled with excitement. It's my first one. I'm in Chicago. That's exciting. How do you like it? Reminds me of New York. A little overwhelming. But the parks are beautiful. Look at this incredible fountain. Angela turned her phone around and panned across Buckingham Fountain with Grant Park in the background. I woke up early to explore before my meeting started. It really is peaceful out here. Nancy peered at the phone, and her eyes suddenly narrowed. Stop. What? What's wrong? Stop moving. Point your camera exactly where it was before. Angela didn't understand her sudden urgency, but she turned the camera as instructed. What's up, sis? Why are you freaking out? There, in the distance, Nancy saw her. A girl in a white t-shirt and blue jeans, with her wavy hair worn in a long ponytail. As she disappeared into a blur of pixels, Nancy gasped. It was Esther. Angie, you have to follow that girl in the white t-shirt and jeans. Angela looked around, baffled. Girl, you're losing it. I don't see anyone dressed like that. Also, getting arrested for stalking seems like a great way to never be sent on a second business trip. Nancy scanned the scene through Angela's camera, but Esther was gone. Fighting to control her pounding heart, Nancy's brain went into overdrive. Angie, send me your location. Nancy had never been to Chicago, but she understood why Esther had chosen it. She wasn't safe in Houston, and Stark did too much business in New York, so she went to the next easiest place to disappear. Angela sent Nancy a pin, and within minutes, Nancy booked a flight to Chicago. Seeing Olivia still deep in conversation with Mrs. Williams, Nancy hurried back to her dorm, filled a small backpack with clothes, and rushed to the airport. Nancy didn't realize she'd bought a first-class ticket until she was boarding the plane, and just as she settled in, a familiar figure caught her eye. Steve's icy gaze met hers, and her face lit up with surprise. You're going to Chicago? Steve nodded and sat down. It would seem so. She didn't dwell on his frosty demeanor. She had long since given up trying to gain his respect, and their relationship would end as soon as she had dealt with Chris. The plane took off, and as they reached cruising altitude, Nancy suddenly felt the stress of the previous few days catch up with her. Her eyes began to flutter in her drowsy state. She thought she recognized a familiar scent, clean and cold, with hints of wood and musk. It was a scent that had enveloped her so many times and made her feel indescribably at ease. Her head drooped, following the scent as she disappeared into a deep slumber. Steve's body tensed as Maria's head landed on his shoulder, and he glanced down at her with irritation. He tried to shift away, but she clung to him even more tightly. Just as he was about to wake her up, her sweet scent filled his nostrils, and he paused. Her face was serene in sleep, a stark contrast to the fiery spirit he'd seen from her the day before. Her dark red lips were slightly parted, and she breathed softly. Taken all together, it was an enchanting image of innocence. Before he could decipher what he was feeling, his breath caught in his throat, and his heart skipped a beat. His gaze lingered on her cheek as she slumbered peacefully beside him. As he wrestled with his decision, a flight attendant approached, whispering softly, "Sir, would you like a blanket for your girlfriend?" Steve hesitated before nodding, and the flight attendant draped the blanket gently over Nancy. Steve attempted to get back to work, but Nancy murmured something in her sleep, and Steve couldn't help but lean in, attempting to decipher her words. Her murmuring stopped as quickly as it had started, but her soft breath tickled his ear and sent an electrifying thrill down his spine. His entire body seemed to tingle, leaving him almost numb. Caught up in the sensation, he was startled to feel a long, dormant part of his body suddenly awakening. But as soon as he focused on it, the sensation vanished. Nancy, meanwhile, was oblivious to the turmoil she was causing in Steve's mind. As she adjusted under the blanket, her hand found his, and she instinctively intertwined their fingers. Her touch was intimate and exhilarating, like secret high school sweethearts holding hands beneath the lunch table desk, or colleagues in a forbidden romance locking fingers under the conference table. A tidal wave of emotion surged within him, and he became acutely aware of how delicate and soft her hand felt. The warmth seemed to slip into the very depths of his soul. He tightened his grip. In her sleep, Nancy sensed her hand being held, but the familiar scent that had drawn her in belonged to someone with different hands. Unlike Jonathan's, these lacked calluses and had long, slender fingers. But for some reason, her thoughts turned to Stark, and she suddenly worried he had come to kill her. Her eyes snapped open, and she instinctively yanked her hand away. The blanket slid down, and she suddenly realized who she'd been sleeping on this whole time. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and she adjusted her posture. "I'm sorry. It was an accident." Steve's hand fell to his side, and his brow furrowed. His tone was cold, but his voice was laced with hurt. "If you want to sleep, adjust the chair. It reclines." "You're right. It won't happen again." Nancy leaned toward the other side of her seat. She couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Why did Steve suddenly have Jonathan's familiar aura? And what did it mean that she instinctively wanted to be close to him? When the flight landed and the doors opened, Nancy stepped over Steve and stormed off the plane without saying a word. Despite the hours that had passed since Esther's mysterious appearance, Nancy felt compelled to visit the fountain from Angela's FaceTime call. She scanned the park, but the sea of tourists and locals yielded no familiar faces. It suddenly hit her that she was trying to find a needle in a haystack, and it was only made more difficult by the fact that neither could reveal their true identities. As Nancy trudged out of the park in dismay, she spotted an ad for a lost cat and suddenly had an idea. She found the nearest print shop, and after a few minutes on a computer, she printed hundreds of flyers with a picture of a cat, along with a phone number and a brief message. "Sammy, your mom wants you to come back home to feast on your favorite fish with cream sauce." She paid school kids to help her hang them, and before long, the streets and alleys of downtown Chicago were plastered with her message. No ordinary person would think twice about it, but Nancy had planned the message specifically for Esther. Sammy was a cat Esther had once raised, and as she got older, she refused to eat anything other than fish with cream sauce. Nancy was certain that if Esther saw the flyer, she would know it was from someone who loved her and find a way to get in touch. After checking into a local hotel, Nancy paced her room, her heart pounding as she awaited a signal from Esther. But when her phone finally rang, a look of guilt flashed across her face. It was Jonathan. "Maria, I'm about to have dinner with my sister and want you to come. I know she'll love you when she sees what you're like without Chloe and Steve around screwing things up." Upon hearing his voice, Nancy's heart sank. "I can't, Jonathan. I'm so sorry." What are you doing? She hesitated. I'm in Chicago, helping a classmate with something. Jonathan's voice was laced with surprise and a hint of betrayal. When did you leave? This afternoon. It came up all of a sudden. His voice was tense and icy now. All right, I understand. Nancy sensed his anger and kept her voice low. Is something wrong? No. All right then. I'll be back in 2 days. See you then? Fine, he said tersely, and then ended the call. Frustrated and embarrassed, Jonathan kicked a stone into the street. Despite their relationship being a secret to others, he had always felt a strong sense of security between the two of them. He always let her know when he was in and out of town, so she would know how to find him. But he got the sense that if he hadn't called her just now, she might never have mentioned the trip to him at all. He'd never actively pursued someone the way he was pursuing Maria, and he hated that she had the power to make him feel spurned by simply not thinking of him. He climbed back into his car and barked orders at Norman. Take me to the Diamond Club and see if Rose wants to meet me there. As Nancy got off the phone with Jonathan, her stomach twisted into a knot. She knew he was upset that she hadn't told him about her trip, but there was nothing she could do about it now. Besides, she had come to Chicago with a purpose. With a deep, shaky breath, she set her phone aside and headed downstairs for dinner. A few hours later, Nancy arrived back at her room still feeling guilty. She picked up her phone to call Jonathan and apologize, but paused when she saw another Google alert. To her surprise, this one was about Jonathan. She opened the page and her jaw dropped. The headline read, Davis Group CEO Jonathan Davis makes semi-public appearance with mysterious new girlfriend. Is love finally in the air for New York's hottest bachelor? Her heart pounding, Nancy clicked the post. Several blurry photos accompanied it, and she recognized the setting with a jolt. The Diamond Club, Jonathan's home turf. He controlled everything that went on there, even the press. In the first photo, Jonathan stood next to a stunning girl in a short, sleeveless dress. Despite the dim lighting, Nancy could tell she was roughly her age and not one of the normal club girls. The other photo showed them leaving the club together and Jonathan helping her into his car. Between the late-night departure and the undeniable intimacy between them, the comment section had erupted in wild speculation and disbelief. Nancy's pulse raced as she stared at the photos. Was this intended to be some kind of warning? Or was she just finding out now that she was one of many women in his carefully managed life? As she pondered, she realized just how little she knew about him. Sure, she knew Latham and Hannah and Kim, but her knowledge of his life outside of that was limited only to what they had done together. She felt as if a bucket of ice water had suddenly been dumped over her head. In her shock, she had a profound realization. Here she was, closer than she'd ever been to finding Esther, and instead of hitting the pavement, she was sitting in her hotel room, worrying about Jonathan. She realized just how far she'd strayed from her original plan, and that her relationship with Jonathan had become an emotional roller coaster that she was no longer sure was worth her time. Ever since her rebirth, her goals were crystal clear. Save Esther and her brother at any cost, find Stark's weakness, and exact bloody revenge on him and Amelia. Jonathan's presence, his intoxicating mix of strength, gentleness, and unexpected warmth, had lured her into a false sense of security. She had even subconsciously started to rely on him, believing he could be her salvation. But now, her eyes were open. He'd shown tonight that at the first sign of trouble, he could instantly replace her with another woman. If she couldn't trust him not to run off, how could she trust him with her plans for vengeance? Dizzy from her cascade of revelations, Nancy set down her phone and went to sleep. The next morning, she went to a nearby neighborhood and hung more flyers. By the time she finished, she was lonely and exhausted, and she trudged back to her hotel, feeling certain that her day couldn't get any worse. As she turned a corner, she abruptly realized how wrong she was. 20 feet away, and heading right toward her, was an all too familiar face, Stark Green. He was dressed for meetings in a crisp white shirt, dark blue tie, and gleaming leather shoes. He held a briefcase and spoke to his assistant when he suddenly looked up and caught Nancy's gaze. His lips curved into a disarming smile. Maria! What a serendipitous encounter! It briefly occurred to Nancy that Stark had come to Chicago to find Esther as well, but his briefcase and relaxed demeanor gave her some measure of relief. Nonetheless, if he had happened to run into Esther while he was here, it could be catastrophic. As much as she hated the idea, she knew the only thing she could do to protect Esther was to distract Stark. Feigning sadness, she pouted. Thank goodness, a friendly face. I went for a walk to clear my head. Now I can't find my way back to my hotel. Stark detected the melancholy in her voice and probed further. Are you traveling alone? Where's your big, strappy boyfriend? Nancy appeared even more upset, her eyes brimming with hurt. We had a terrible fight. Stark turned to his assistant. Clear the rest of my afternoon and reschedule everything for tomorrow. He shifted his attention back to Nancy. Since you led the way in New York, allow me to lead the way here. I know an exquisite restaurant down the street that will make you forget all about that cruel Mr. Davis. Nancy felt disgusted by the idea of sharing a meal with him, but as long as she kept him close, he couldn't hurt Esther. At that moment, Nancy spotted another familiar figure coming up from behind Stark, his girlfriend Amelia. She seemed to be rushing toward them, so Nancy looked up at Stark. I'm afraid your girlfriend is going to be angry. I might as well be your big brother. What could she possibly be mad about? Nancy shook her head in a show of obliviousness. As Amelia got closer, Nancy spoke just loud enough to make sure she could hear. I don't know, Mr. Green. She just seemed consumed by the jealousy the last time I saw her. You should have seen the looks she gave me. Suddenly, Amelia burst between them, eyes lit up with rage. Well, isn't this a convenient coincidence? What's the deal, Maria? You don't have enough fun in that little Davis sandwich of yours, so you thought you'd come steal some of mine? She raised her hand to slap Nancy, but Stark grabbed her wrist. Amelia, are you out of your mind? He flung her wrist away, and she stumbled backward. Seeing Stark defend Nancy, Amelia's anger intensified. She spat on the ground. Is there any powerful man you don't throw yourself at? She then turned to Stark. Tell me, darling, do you think about her when you're with me? Enough! Stark roared. Amelia stared at him, her voice high and cutting. You would defend her over me? Nancy knew how conscious Stark was of his image. She'd never seen him lose his temper in public before, and it was suddenly clear just how much of a wedge she'd driven between them. Stark seized Amelia's arm, and his voice was cold and deadly. Amelia, you've gone too far. She leveled a glare back at him, but before she could respond, Nancy intervened to twist the knife. Hiding behind Stark, she pulled on his sleeve, her eyes brimming with fear. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. Please, don't worry about me. I'll find my way home on my own. Then she turned to Amelia. It's all a horrible misunderstanding. I promise I won't speak to him again. Just let me go, and I'll give you two some space. Amelia scowled. Good, then beat it. Nancy turned to flee, but just as she expected, Stark was taken with her performance. He shrugged Amelia aside and chased after Nancy. Please don't cry, Maria. If anyone deserves an apology, it's you. I'll take you to lunch and then make sure you get home safe. Amelia can use that time to think about the way she's behaving. Suddenly, Amelia's cartoonish rage froze into an icy stare. Stark, if you leave with this woman, do you honestly think I won't do something you'll regret? Stark's footsteps halted. Slowly, he turned to face Amelia, his eyes steely and his tone chilling. If you think it's wise to test me, then by all means, be my guest. Amelia's hands clenched into a fist, her nails digging into her palm. But with no more arrows to fire, she swallowed her rage and stormed off without another word. Nancy looked at Stark, her eyes still fearful. I felt terrible. She must really hate me. Amelia jumps to conclusions. I'm sorry she dragged you into this. Now then, how about that exquisite meal you were promised? As they ventured to the restaurant together, Nancy's mind drifted. The relationship between Stark and Amelia was clearly fraught with tension, yet for some reason, they had never broken up. The only explanation Nancy could think of was the intricate web of lies and self-interest binding them together. Only the two of them had the power to take the other one down, but it was mutually assured destruction. Nancy couldn't be sure how strong the threads were that held them together, but she was confident that when the time came to enact her full revenge, she would be able to exploit the countless fissures between them. Their food arrived swiftly, and Stark encouraged Nancy to dig in. His tone was gentle and polite, and his conversation devoid of jokes or innuendo. Nancy recognized his attempt to lure her into a false sense of security, but she couldn't help laughing at how utterly different Stark and Jonathan were. After lunch, Stark insisted on escorting Nancy to several tourist attractions before taking her back to her hotel. Nancy played along, even submitting herself to the torture of taking multiple selfies with him around town. When the sun finally began to set, she felt a wave of relief that they hadn't run into Esther. Still, she couldn't help feeling discouraged that she hadn't seen a single sign of her since Angela's FaceTime. After one final destination, Stark offered to escort Nancy back to her hotel. When she told him where she was staying, he grinned broadly. Another wonderful coincidence. I'm staying at the very same one. When they entered the lobby, Nancy caught a glimpse of Amelia lurking in the shadows, and it gave her another idea. Stark had been trying to find ways to make physical contact with her all day. If he and Amelia were as vulnerable as they seemed, she knew exactly how to take advantage. Once she was safely back in her room, Nancy started up her computer and found a local escort service. Using a VPN and a voice modulator, she ordered escorts for over a dozen rooms, one of which was Stark's. 10 minutes later, a sultry woman, who Nancy hand-picked due to their resemblance to one another, sauntered up to Stark's door. She knocked playfully, and when the door swung open, it revealed a freshly showered Stark, water droplets still glistening on his skin. The woman ran a finger down his chest and then flirtatiously licked the water off. She leaned on the doorway and purred seductively. Did I catch you at a bad time? Amelia had been sitting in the lobby all afternoon, waiting for Stark to return, her heart heavy with the decision to relent. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw Maria and Stark head upstairs together, and after a torturous half-hour without seeing Maria come down, she couldn't resist calling. The phone rang a few times before abruptly disconnecting. Furious, she called again, her fingers shaking. This time, he answered on the second ring. She was about to unleash her fury when she heard the unmistakable sounds of intimacy. Feeling as if she were going mad, she clutched her phone and stormed towards the elevator. Stark, you pushed me to do this. She raged internally and fiercely jabbed the button for his floor. Exiting the elevator, she strode up to Stark's door and pounded on it. Inside, Stark was fully entwined with the escort, and as the dim light played across their naked bodies, he couldn't help but fantasize about Maria, murmuring her name with fervent desperation. Suddenly, his phone rang, its shrill tones slicing through the heavy atmosphere. He tried to hang it up, but accidentally answered it before he tossed it aside. Unaware of who was listening, Stark continued calling out Maria's name in a low, raspy voice, filled with longing. When he heard frantic banging on the door, he did his best to ignore it, until it finally stopped. 20 minutes later, the banging suddenly came back. With a booming crack, Stark's door was smashed in with a ram, and police rushed in and guns raised. "Chicago police! Put your hands on your head!" Stark acquiesced as a police officer wrapped the woman in a blanket. "Don't worry, miss. You're safe now. He can't hurt anyone. His mind swirling with confusion, Stark's gaze shot toward the doorway, and he saw Amelia standing there, holding her phone, grinning smugly at Stark's predicament. Downstairs, Nancy was busy checking out of the hotel. Her heart raced as she saw the police rush in, and she quickly hailed a cab to the airport to avoid being swept up in the chaos. She made sure not to leave behind any evidence of her anonymous call to the escort service, and had even posed as hotel staff, calling on behalf of a VIP client. Stark was certain to investigate, but he would only discover that dozens of men in the hotel had been approached the same way. She knew Amelia wouldn't take the affront lying down, but the police with the battering ram was better than Nancy could have ever hoped for. Certain that Stark would now be distracted for the next day or two, Nancy decided to make one more pit stop before she went back to New York. She headed to Houston to check in on Jacob. As soon as she arrived at the airport in Chicago, she purchased a neutral set of men's sportswear and holed up in the restroom to change and apply makeup. When she finally emerged, her baseball cap and loose clothes disguised her identity and blurred her gender so that no one could possibly recognize her. Her flight landed before dawn, and Nancy arrived outside her old family home just as the sun peaked above the horizon. After she died, Stark had taken up residence in the house as a public display of love for the family. Jacob still lived there with him, and tears filled Nancy's eyes as wonderful memories of her childhood floated through her mind. Bathed in soft morning light and enveloped in a hazy glow, the whole scene felt ethereal and otherworldly. She was desperate to run up and knock on the door, but she didn't dare. Stark would have his staff on high alert in his absence, and she could spot at least 12 surveillance cameras scattered around the premises. She gazed from a distance, her heart aching for the time and the family that Stark and Amelia had stolen from her. With her fists clenched and her eyes welling up with tears, Nancy realized how exposed she was and decided to try Jacob's school. But as she took one last, longing glance at her childhood home, someone came sprinting out from the gated entrance. Her breath caught as they locked gazes, and she knew right away that Jacob recognized her. He waved to the leery maid behind him and took off on his morning run. As he turned onto the quiet road and sped toward Nancy, she saw nothing but cold determination in his eyes. That morning in New York, Jonathan awoke to a scandal about him plastered all over the internet. He'd had his fair share of encounters with the paparazzi over the years, but before long, he managed to scare them into leaving him out of their papers altogether. Now, as he saw himself trending, disbelief and anger coursed through him. Someone had dared to delve into his personal life, and then they ran the story before even checking the details. No reporter had been this audacious with him in years, and he knew he had to send a message that open season on Jonathan Davis would never be acceptable. Jonathan slammed his fist on the table and dialed Jack's number. "Find out who reported this so-called scandal and give me a list of every site that's picked it up. I want answers. Now." An hour later, Jack called him back. "It was a rookie reporter, sir. When I confronted him, his editors came down groveling and begging for mercy. They say it won't happen again." Jonathan sneered before asking, "And what do you think should be done with this reporter?" Jack replied coldly, "He's here with me. We had a nice chat. Not sure he's in much of a mood to talk, but I think he's learned his lesson." "Good. No need for a public response then. We seem to have caught it before it went wide. Make sure our reporter knows he's getting off lucky." "Understood, boss. And Maria? Want me to investigate?" Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "I'll handle Maria myself." Jonathan hung up and did a quick search to verify that his story had been wiped from the internet. Just as he was about to set his phone down, he noticed what had replaced his picture at the top of the trending feed. It was a selfie of a pop singer and her ex-boyfriend, announcing that they had broken up during a vacation in Chicago. They had taken a selfie in the first-class cabin of an airplane, and in the background of their picture, Jonathan's eyes were immediately drawn to two familiar faces: Steve and Nancy. Steve seemed engrossed in paperwork, while Nancy leaned against his shoulder, fast asleep beneath a blanket. Jonathan's gaze lingered on the peaceful pair, his eyes darkening with a storm of emotions. Had Nancy gone to Chicago out of nowhere, just to be alone with Steve? How could she even have known? Jonathan had arranged his flight at the last minute, and had even given him his shirt when he spilled coffee on his own on the way out the door. Were they really hiding an entire romance right underneath his nose? The questions and coincidences left him feeling a volatile mix of confusion and frustration. But every time he talked himself down, he looked at the picture again. Their intimacy was unmistakable. Jonathan had always believed Maria's feelings for Steve would fade, especially given his utter lack of reciprocation. But Jonathan now saw that he was painfully mistaken. He knew Steve well. He had never allowed others into his personal space so easily, especially not women. Yet there was Maria, resting peacefully on his shoulder. A jagged, bitter pain tore through Jonathan's heart, followed by an absurd instinct to laugh, and then an overwhelming rage. He refused to play the fool for the press, and he refused to do it with Steve and Maria either. Nevertheless, each time he tried to force himself to accept the evidence in front of him and let Maria go, he found it impossible. He was going to have to confront her. Nancy's heart pounded as she walked slowly forward, and Jacob ran right at her. Just as they passed each other, Nancy leaned in, and their shoulders collided. She threw her phone to the ground, and without hesitation, Jacob swooped down to pick it up, checking for any damage to the screen. Seizing the moment, Nancy whispered to him urgently, "Jacob, when I need to rescue you, and that day will come, how can I contact you?" Jacob's grip on the phone tightened. He quickly tapped in a series of numbers and handed the phone back to her. There was also a short message with no punctuation. "Tell my sister I love her." Nancy hesitated, fighting back tears. "She loves you too, Jacob, and what I told you at the exhibition is still true. Trust no one but yourself, and when the day comes, make sure you're ready for anything." The young man's back stiffened, but he didn't react. He just continued running. As she watched him disappear around the bend, Nancy realized her brother had truly come into his own. He was strong, independent, patient, and wise. It was a tragic irony that their parents couldn't be there to see it. As Nancy settled in for her flight back to New York, Stark was boarding his own flight from Chicago to Houston. He'd spent the entire day haranguing the media and the police, greasing countless palms to make the photos and police reports disappear. As far as he was concerned, the only crime he was guilty of was hating his girlfriend, and much to his chagrin, she was sitting right next to him. Content with her retribution, Amelia tried to engage him in conversation throughout the journey, but the previous night's chaos was still fresh in his mind. His fury had been all-encompassing, yet he'd managed to keep his composure and stay focused on the bigger picture. When they got to Houston, he would decide how to deal with Amelia. She was becoming a serious liability, and he'd spent a small fortune cleaning up her little mess in Chicago. Until he could take full control over the Franklin Group's wealth, it was a fortune he couldn't afford. Upon arriving back home, Stark stormed into the villa, and Amelia sped off in her car. The maids, sensing his mood, quickly prepared his tea. He lined them up, and in an icy tone, asked for updates. "What happened while I was away?" One of the maids cautiously replied, "Everything has been normal, Mr. Green. Jacob is taking up morning jogs recently, perhaps to regain his strength after being sick." "Morning jogs?" Stark's frown deepened. "To where? With who?" "Just by himself around the neighborhood. You know how he is. Not a lot of friends. He really is looking healthier, though." "Very well. Send a car with him in the future, though. Remember, there are people out there that might want to hurt him. Maybe even worse. We can never be too careful with his safety." The staff nodded and dispersed, and as Stark gazed out the window, a coy smile played at his lips. He was going to have Maria for himself, and not even Amelia could stop him. No sooner had Nancy stepped out of the plane in New York than she received a call from Venus, her voice breathless. "Maria, I found the evidence. Nancy was stunned, but she shook it off and replied with determination. I'm on my way. For the rest of the afternoon, Nancy, Venus, and their lawyer pored over Chris's financial documents. The tension was palpable, and after a long beat of consideration, the lawyer spoke in a grave tone. This indeed proves a number of financial crimes, but none of them rise above basic tax fraud, which is usually a slap on the wrist for a first-time offender. 6 months to a year at most. Nancy's shoulders dropped, frustration boiling within her. It was too lenient for Chris. He had caused so much pain to too many women. 6 months wasn't even close to what they had been through. Venus turned to Nancy. There's more evidence in his office. I know it, but how do we possibly get it? He doesn't let anyone enter his space. I'll find another way. Nancy pounded the table with her palm. Her mind immediately went to Jonathan. He'd be the fastest route to digging up more dirt on Chris. But Nancy couldn't bring herself to ask him for help. She was determined to break her cycle of reliance on him and establish more independence. She and Venus locked eyes, and from their desperate expressions, it was clear they were both worried they'd hit a dead end. It was late when Nancy and Venus finally parted ways. Her dorms were closed, and she refused to step foot in Chris's home again, so she checked into a nearby hotel. Exhausted from her trip, she quickly fell into a deep sleep. A few hours later, her phone rang and jolted her awake. It was Jonathan. What's wrong? Do you know what time it is? His voice came back steady and intense. I'm at your door. Still in a daze, Nancy went to the door and checked the peephole. The distorted lens elongated his furrowed brow in a way that made him look especially moody. When she finally unlocked the door, he shoved inside, snatched the phone from her hand, and pinned her against the wall. His movements were swift and fierce, leaving Nancy no time to react. Her back hit the wall with a painful thud, and his lips locked onto hers. He had never kissed her like this before, not even during their bathroom encounter at the Diamond Club. It was as if he wanted to consume her completely. His powerful hand gripped her waist tightly, making her feel as though she might break. She finally managed to free her mouth for a moment. Is this how you say hello to every woman? Or just me? Without responding, Jonathan lifted her onto his shoulder. The world spun until she suddenly found herself on the soft hotel bed. The faint light in the hallway had masked Jonathan's expression, but as the bedside lamp illuminated his face, Nancy saw that his eyes seemed to be shrouded with impenetrable darkness. His lips were drawn tight, and his jaw was clenched with determination. With his hair mussed and his tie partly loosened, he looked like some kind of wild, wounded animal, a stranger Nancy had never seen before. Fear crept into her heart. Jonathan, she stammered, but before she could finish, his lips silenced her once more, drowning out her words. Her heart thundered in her chest, like a small boat caught in the tempest's wrath. These interactions had always felt like a calculated game to her before, but he seemed frantic in a way she wasn't used to. She never meant to provoke this side of him, but it seemed fate had other plans. Nancy momentarily dodged his kiss and looked up at him. Are we fighting or kissing? He halted abruptly, his pupils narrowing to the size of a pinprick. Their eyes locked, intertwined in an unbreakable stare, neither daring to speak or move. Finally, Jonathan shattered the silence. What am I to you? Nancy was startled. What do you mean? You're the one who barged in here. Answer your own question. A sardonic smile twisted Jonathan's lips. You should know that I went to Chicago with Steve. I was going to tell you about it, but I was too busy sleeping on his shoulder. Nancy's brow furrowed. Did he have her followed? Or had Steve betrayed the secret himself? Why would he do that? As Jonathan noticed her lack of denial, his smile broadened, but his eyes became frigid. It would also appear you asked him to investigate your father's business and consult lawyers on your behalf. And is it a coincidence that Stark Green was at the exact same hotel as you and wound up in a hurricane of bad press just as you skipped town? She stammered, and he continued. Explain any one of those to me. I'm begging you. Give me a single reason to believe I'm not utterly insignificant to you, because when I look at the evidence, that's all I see." Nancy looked at Jonathan. She hadn't expected such an emotional plea. He wasn't wrong to feel spurned, but how could she possibly explain any of the issues he raised? The first was simple. She had fallen asleep on Steve by accident, but surely he wouldn't believe her if he'd already convinced himself she was hiding something. As for the second, it was mere hours ago that she'd resolved to take Chris down on her own. She wasn't going to mortgage her pride to soothe his ego. Third was the most complex of all. Jonathan knew she didn't like Stark, but there was no way she could divulge everything about her rebirth when she couldn't even trust Jonathan not to spy on her. Her mind raced, but she found no word. Jonathan looked at her in silence, and disappointment clouded his eyes. He slowly withdrew from her. "Have you ever even considered trusting me with your whole heart? Or have you always had one foot out the door?" He was right, that she couldn't bring herself to trust him unconditionally. They shared responsibility for that, but at the end of the day, her decision could impact the lives of her brother and Esther. She simply couldn't risk their safety on someone as volatile as Jonathan. The light in his eyes flickered and died. "I swore to myself that I would never give up on you, that I would always find a way forward, but you've wounded and exhausted me. I've given you far too much of myself to continue receiving nothing but disdain in return. I deserve better." Nancy watched him, unblinking, as he put his clothes back on. Under the angular light, he appeared cold, distant, and unapproachable. He strode to the door, but instead of opening it, he picked up a file and tossed it to her. "That's what you get when you ask for help from someone who truly loves you." His tone was icy and detached now. "I'm sorry for disturbing you. Good night." Without another glance, Jonathan left the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and Nancy's heart clenched. She slowly opened the file, and her jaw dropped. There were reams of evidence implicating Chris in extortion, racketeering, bribery, and then some. It was everything she and Venus had hoped for, and more. Her heart soared as she realized that Chris would face at least a decade behind bars. Even upon release, he lacked the money and influence to manipulate his family ever again. As she scanned the black and white text, her vision blurred. She reached up and found her cheeks stained with tears. The dam within her heart burst, and sadness consumed her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jonathan's figure retreating wordlessly out the door. Without even being asked, he had taken it upon himself to improve her life in a way that did nothing for him at all. As tears turned to sobs, she was forced to admit that she cared far more deeply about Jonathan than she ever imagined she could. Outside the hotel, Jonathan considered turning back, but pressed forward. A searing pain tore through his heart, and an emotion he had never experienced before erupted within his chest. He was truly heartbroken, but he was also angry. He picked up his phone and made a terse call. "Gather the rest of the Crimson Circle and tell them to prepare for a strike. It's time we take back what those idiots at Advanced Tech stole from us." About 10 minutes later, Norman pulled up in front of Jonathan. He climbed into the car and greeted a girl in the front passenger seat. It was none other than the woman he'd been photographed with days earlier. She looked to be no more than 20 and was dressed like an ordinary college student. She turned to Jonathan in the back seat. "I've rallied the troops, and they're waiting for us near the Advantech headquarters in the financial district." "Good. Thank you, Rose." Jonathan's voice was laced with determination, his mood dark and in search of violent catharsis. The car sped toward their destination, where several windowless vans were parked in an alleyway between two high-rises. Jonathan exited the car first, followed by Norman and Rose. As men piled out of the vans, they were all dressed in black tactical gear and addressed him as Sir. Despite her young age, Rose was clearly the second in command. Jonathan quickly addressed them. "As you know, hackers stole huge portions of our next-gen car research off our servers last year. We were able to claw most of it back, but Rose recently learned that it was a move by Advantech to cripple us before we got off the starting line. We're here to let them know what happens when they mess with the Davis Group." Rose has given you your orders. Let's move. As they walked toward a surface entrance, one of the men began drilling out the lock. Jonathan produced a machine pistol with a silencer and handed it to Rose, but she shook her head as she stretched her shoulders and cracked her knuckles. No thanks. I like to do my work up close and personal. Jonathan grinned savagely. Suit yourself. That night, downtown Manhattan buzzed with rumors of gunshots and blood-curdling screams in the heart of the financial district. But as the sun rose, there were no sirens and no news coverage. Just a man in a janitor's suit power washing the alley. Meanwhile, a mere 2 blocks away, Nancy met with Venus at the district attorney's office. Together, they handed over all the evidence against Chris, and the clerk's jaw dropped. She declared it an open and shut case and thanked them for their service to the city. As Nancy and Venus parted ways, she suddenly received a call from Olivia. Her heart broke whenever she thought of her, but she tried to sound positive. Hey, Liv, how are you feeling? She was met with a fierce cough, then Olivia's tragically weak voice. I'm great. Just wanted to tell you that last night I decided to move the wedding up to tomorrow. Hope that won't be a problem for you. Of course not. I'll call Hannah and see what I can do to help. Thank you so much, Maria. You don't know how much this means to me. But before Olivia could say goodbye, she descended into another violent coughing fit. As Nancy hung up, she was filled with a heavy sadness. The sudden change of date seemed to suggest that Olivia's situation had worsened, and they didn't think she'd make it to the end of the week. To make matters worse, Nancy hadn't spoken to Jonathan since their tense encounter at the hotel. And in a matter of hours, she'd be walking down the aisle with her as maid of honor and him as best man. She sighed with anticipation and headed to the dress store to meet Hannah. The day of Olivia's wedding finally arrived. Nancy went to Olivia's hotel room early that morning, and the first thing she noticed was how frail she had gotten in just a few days. At 5'2" and barely 90 pounds, her once perfectly fitted wedding dress now hung loose on her emaciated frame. Suddenly, Olivia's phone rang, and a smile spread across her face. Maria, do you remember the woman we met at the hospital? She and I formed this incredible bond, and she asked me to be her goddaughter. I called her yesterday to see if she could make it to the wedding, and she just landed in New York. Tears welled up in Nancy's eyes, and she managed to choke smile. That's amazing. I'm so glad you two found each other. I'll save her a seat in the front row. It sounds strange to say, but I feel a bond with her that I've never experienced with anyone else. Like somehow our souls were connected and just drew us together. Her eyes were filled with longing and affection. With her losing her daughter, just makes you appreciate how precious good health is. Nancy struggled to find the right words, then pulled Olivia into a tight embrace. Don't worry about the past. Don't worry about the future. Today is all that counts, and it's going to be incredible. Not long after, Hannah spotted a luxurious motorcade from the hotel window. They're here, she exclaimed, helping Olivia to her feet. The groom and groomsmen arrived shortly after, with Steve filling in for Xavier, who couldn't make it last minute. As the hotel door opened, Nancy caught sight of Jonathan, and her breath caught in her throat. He looked impeccable in a tailored tux, with his short hair neatly styled and his sharp jawline set off by a perfectly dimpled bow tie. Latham, decked out in a black suit with a rose on his lapel, scooped Olivia into his arms and carried her to the car. Nancy and Jonathan followed, and though Nancy couldn't tell whether it was by chance or design, they wound up sharing a car. Nancy wore a pink bridesmaid's dress and struggled with the skirt as it billowed in the breeze of the convertible sports car. When it draped itself over Jonathan's legs, she hurriedly pulled it away and immediately blushed. Sorry. Jonathan remained cool. It's fine. The tension between them made the drive unbearably long. Nancy's skirt refused to stay in place, and she found herself leaning toward Jonathan for support. She wanted to thank him for the information he'd provided in the case against Chris, but the words remained stubbornly lodged in her throat. At last, they arrived at the wedding venue, and Nancy exhaled a sigh of relief. Jonathan stepped out of the car and circled to help Nancy with her door. As she emerged, she looked up and saw the powerful lines of his neck. "Thank you, Jonathan." "My pleasure, Maria." His Adam's apple shifted subtly, and it struck Nancy that Jonathan's frostiness was etched into his very core. He didn't have to perform it like Steve. It was simply who he was. The wedding party entered the venue and greeted guests while awaiting the ceremony. It was mostly Latham's close friends and family, with the intimate guest list serving as a testament to his warm personality. After ensuring Olivia was resting in the lounge, Latham joined the greeting line until a man he didn't recognize rolled up in a wheelchair. Latham frowned. "I'm sorry. Do I know you? Are you friends with Olivia?" Because she didn't mention, the man cut him off. "I'm John, her ex-husband. Can I speak to you for a moment?" Latham hesitated before agreeing, leading John to a secluded corner of the atrium. "Listen, Olivia is fragile right now, and I think you being here is likely to make that worse, not better. I'd appreciate it if you left." "You've got it all wrong." John's voice was weak from his recent surgery. "Let me share a story that might change your mind. When we were all in college, Olivia and I were platonic friends, nothing else. We shared so many things with each other, and I remember how often she told me that despite your struggles with money, she was happy with you and didn't care about anything but being together." Latham flinched as he heard their painful story recounted, but allowed John to continue. "Then, the summer after we graduated, Olivia's mother fell ill and needed a cutting-edge treatment that none of them could afford. Olivia exhausted every option and was finally forced to borrow from a loan shark on the evening of her mother's surgery. When the sharks came to collect, she kept it a secret to protect you and your family, and that's when she broke things off." Latham's mouth tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" John just continued at the same pace. "At the same time, my family was pressuring me to get married and take over the family company. I'm gay, which Olivia had always known, and when I heard about what happened, I offered a mutually beneficial lie. If we got married, my family could support her and her mom, and having her around on holidays would appease my parents. Besides a few days every year, we lived independently as friends." Latham looked stunned, and John nodded. "That's the true story of our marriage. I knew she would never betray my trust, so I came here to tell you that. And she never stopped loving you the entire time. I wish you both every happiness, and I hope you'll tell her the same." With those words, John wheeled himself away, leaving Latham with tears streaming down his cheeks. Suddenly he looked up and called out, "Wait!" John spun back, and Latham opened the door for him. "I think you should tell her yourself." The moment the ceremony arrived and Latham raced through the guest area, a practiced smile masking his inner turmoil, he swung open the door to the lounge and rushed in. "Olivia, are you awake?" His voice wavered as he approached her. She was asleep, snoring softly, and the sunlight bathing her fragile features made her face appear almost ethereal. Latham's heart ached, and his throat grew tight with emotion. He took several steadying breaths before leaning over and kissing her on the cheek. "My love, our future awaits." Her eyelashes fluttered, and she opened her eyes. A feeble but radiant smile graced her lips. "Then what are we waiting for?" Latham stood and gently lifted her, her gown flowing across the couch and the floor like an ocean of soft white waves. As they passed the door, Latham's eyes were drawn to the trash can, where there was a bloody rag and an empty syringe. Olivia studied him. "It's just a painkiller. How else would I get through marrying you?" She winked, and Latham couldn't help but chuckle. What Latham didn't know was that Olivia could no longer feel her body. She had vomited blood again, and the agony was so overwhelming that she'd injected herself with a double dose of the potent painkiller. Now, her body was numb, and she could only stare into Latham's handsome face, just as she had done when they were young. The dream she had longed for since the day they met was unfolding before her. It seemed too good to be true. She was genuinely about to marry the man she'd adored for nearly a decade? Faint music swelled as images of their life danced across screens on either side of the stage. Long-faded memories were suddenly vibrant as their story played out before her eyes. She remembered their first meeting at school, the first time they held hands by the lake, and their tender first kiss beneath the stands at a basketball game. She recalled wrapping her arms around him from the back seat of his beat-up motorcycle, feeling his taut muscles beneath her fingertips. She could see the sweat on his brow, glistening as they rode together. As these memories swirled in her mind, Latham carried her down the aisle. He ascended the steps and gently set her down on stage, supporting her the whole way. As she leaned against him, her vision blurred, but she was still able to make out Miss Williams in the front row, smiling at her through teary eyes. Olivia returned her smile before locking eyes with Latham. The officiant cued them to exchange vows, and Latham helped her lean against a nearby pillar before removing a ring from his pocket. The gesture struck her heart like a bolt of lightning and pulled her back to the electrifying present. For a brief moment, there was no pain, just Latham. The two of them locked eyes, Latham's intensity unwavering as a vulnerable smile played across his lips. Olivia, before you, my life was a reckless blur. I used to believe love was like drinking a beer, enjoyable for a time, but stale before it ran dry. That all changed when I met you. Your love was an endless fountain, and I could never get enough. Since we've reunited, I've spent countless hours imagining the life we might have shared. Having kids, showing them the paths we walked, the places we ate, the bars where we drank. Even the Latham loves Olivia, carved into walls and tree trunks all across the city. I imagined growing old together, watching sunrises and sunsets from our wheelchairs. And that's when I realized that no amount of time would ever be enough. I'd always be left grasping for more. So instead of worrying about tomorrow, let's be grateful for now. I love you so much, Olivia. Tears filled Latham's eyes, spilling down his cheeks as he slid the ring on her finger. Olivia's face was streaked with tears too, as she gazed back at him. Loving you is the greatest joy of my life, and the easiest decision I've ever made. Olivia tried to slide his ring on, but her shaking hands were too weak. Latham reached out and guided his finger in. The officiant pronounced them married, and he immediately pulled her into a passionate embrace, their lips pressed together in a tender, desperate kiss. When their kiss finally ended, Latham gazed into her eyes and spoke softly, his voice cracking. How about we throw the bouquet? Olivia nodded, smiling through her tears. Together they turned and threw their bouquet over their heads into the crowd. Below the stage, Nancy was fighting back tears as the inevitability of Latham's and Olivia's separation weighed heavily on her heart. In that exact moment, the bouquet landed directly in her lap. Nancy stared at the flowers in shock, then immediately blushed. Latham chimed in, trying to lighten the moods. So, when's your wedding going to be, Maria? One of his friends piled on. Yeah, Steve, how about it? Ready to propose to Maria yet? Nancy looked up just in time to see an indecipherable smile spread across Steve's face. Directly behind him, Jonathan's gaze was fixed on the bouquet in her hands. As she tried to look away, they abruptly locked eyes. For a brief moment, Jonathan's fiery gaze burned into her soul and stopped time, leaving nothing but the pounding of Nancy's heart in her chest. Reception began immediately after the ceremony, and the music swelled as two of Latham's nieces wheeled a magnificent cake into the room. Latham guided Olivia to her seat, then quickly sliced the cake for their guests. As Mrs. Williams accepted her slice, she discreetly handed Latham a pair of earrings. Give these to Olivia for me. I had hoped to give them to my own daughter on her wedding day, and nothing would make me happier than for her to have them. Thank you so much, Mrs. Williams. I know she'll adore them. After distributing the cake, Latham returned to Olivia's side, and she looked up at him with weary eyes. I hate to be the girl that takes a nap in the middle of her own wedding, But could you take me back to the lounge to rest? Of course, my love. Do you want me to command everyone else to take a nap so you don't miss anything? I'll do it. He smiled slyly, cradling her in his arms. Right after you stuffed them full of sugar? Yeah, that would go great. Latham chuckled and slipped her out a side door back into the garden. As they strolled along a path adorned with fresh flowers, Latham reminisced. Do you remember our first fateful encounter in the library at the University of Houston? We both reached for the same book, but there was only one copy. You handed it to me without hesitation, and I called after you, but you never looked back. Olivia's brow furrowed as she searched her memories. When was that? Just a month before we officially met in New York. Latham answered. She shook her head, puzzled. Latham, I think you're mistaken. I've never been to Houston. A flicker of confusion crossed Latham's face, but he soon smiled warmly. Maybe I got the place wrong, but I know how I felt. I was captivated by your beauty from the moment I laid eyes on you, and I've loved you more every day since. Your godmother gave me these earrings for you. Do you want to put them on? Olivia reached out and carefully fastened them to her earlobes. Under the light, the green pendant appeared like a glowing teardrop. As Latham carried her through the sea of flowers, Olivia suddenly called his name, her voice filled with emotion. Latham. Her eyes sparkled with intensity. His heart skipped a beat, and he smiled down at her. Yes, darling. I will always love you. Her voice was a whisper as her hand reached up to caress his face. Latham stared into her eyes, and time seemed to stand still. The tender touch of her fingers lingered on his skin as she closed her eyes. Her hand floated down slowly like a feather caught in the breeze. Latham's heart constricted. He hurried her to the lounge and gently laid her down on the bed. Her eyes were closed, and her cheeks and lips were still flush, giving the appearance of a restful sleep. But when Latham put his ear to her chest, he knew it was over. Latham collapsed to the ground, cradling her body. His shoulders shook with uncontrollable grief, the distance between life and death feeling all at once so close and so impossibly far. Though he held her tightly, he could feel her body growing cold, never to warm again. He bent down next to her and choked out a whisper. Sleep well, my love. Back at the reception, Nancy noticed Latham's prolonged absence and went to look for him. As she approached the lounge door, she heard a man's muffled sobbing, and realization crashed over her like a wave. Jonathan arrived just after her, and they shared a tender, broken-hearted glance. Just as she started to speak, the door opened. Latham wiped his red-trimmed eyes and stammered, Olivia, she's gone. Latham crumbled to the floor in front of Jonathan, burying his face in his knees, broken by grief. Nancy rushed into the room and found Olivia looking serene and peaceful. Her stomach immediately twisted into a knot, and tears poured down her face. She didn't just mourn for Olivia and Latham. She also mourned for Olivia and Esther, who went their whole lives without knowing the other existed. She gazed at Olivia's jade earrings and took a deep breath. Olivia, did you know there's another girl in this world who looks just like you? She loves to laugh and is full of life, but what she always wanted most of all was a sister. It turns out she had one. Fate just kept them apart for a little too long. Nancy continued fighting back tears. She'll return soon. I'll make sure of it. And when she does, I promise I'll bring her to meet you. She kissed Olivia on the forehead, wiped her tears, and left the room. As Nancy exited, Hannah was pleading with Jonathan. Can we call someone? There must be something we can do. Nancy struggled to wipe the tears from her face, and Jonathan gently handed her a tissue. She looked up at him, and though he was speaking with Hannah, he was looking directly at her. She left with a smile on her face, gazing into the eyes of the only person she ever loved. We should all hope to go that way. A few hours later, Latham still sat in the lounge, with his gaze fixed on Olivia. Nancy watched as he turned to Jonathan with a desperate tone. Why did I hide my identity from her? Why didn't I chase after her? If I had just opened up, would she still be here? Jonathan hesitated before speaking. Latham, I can't answer that question, but I believe if Olivia could, she would tell you not to blame yourself. Latham looked up, forcing a smile through tears. I'll always regret how much time I wasted. But you're right. Olivia said she loved my laugh more than anything. I won't dwell in misery, and I'll do my best to live a life that she'd be proud of. He stood and embraced Jonathan tightly. Thank you. When he released Jonathan, he turned to address Nancy, Hannah, and Mrs. Williams. Everyone's exhausted. Get yourselves home and rest. I'll take care of Olivia's final journey myself. Despite Latham's insistence, everyone remained with him until Olivia's body had been cremated and laid to rest. Once the funeral was over, Latham told his friends that he'd return in a month to officially take over his parents' company and work on honoring Olivia's memory. In the meantime, he planned to take some of Olivia's ashes on their honeymoon and scatter them in all the places they dreamed of seeing together. It had barely been 2 weeks since Olivia's funeral when Nancy and Emma received official offers of employment from the Davis Group. On the following Monday, they arrived at the Human Resources Department with all of the other interns, but were quickly called aside by an HR manager. As both of you know, our internship programs involve 2-week rotations through all the various technical departments. You two have been specifically requested by the Director of Artificial Intelligence, so you can make your way there now. As Nancy entered the sprawling, state-of-the-art AI lab, she suddenly recognized a familiar face. Peter grinned as Nancy and Emma approached. When I saw your names on the list, I demanded we get you first. I don't want any of the lesser departments sinking their claws into you before we have a chance to show you what we're doing. We don't have any strict roles here, and everything depends on your skills, so I'm going to throw you right in and see where you end up. True to his words, Peter immediately had them participating in high-stakes departmental meetings and viewing hundreds of pages of highly detailed tests and technical reports. Time flew by as Nancy threw herself into the work, until one fatal morning when it all threatened to come crashing down. It was a Monday morning, and her eyes slowly fluttered open. A bolt of panic shot through the fog in her mind. She was looking at her clock, and it said the time was already 8:45. She had forgotten to set her alarm, and she was expected to give her first presentation to the heads of the department in exactly 15 minutes. She sprang out of bed, threw her hair in a bun, and bolted out the door. After narrowly making her train and cutting across 3 avenues to the Davis Group headquarters, she reached the front desk with 3 minutes to spare. She hurried to the elevators and frantically stabbed at the up button, but the display showed all the elevators slowly making their way down. She glanced at the stairs, but she was headed to the 36th floor. She would never make it. Just as she thought her morning couldn't get any worse, Nancy heard the receptionist's voice behind her. Good morning, Jonathan. Nancy whipped around to see Jonathan and Jack walking towards the executive elevator right beside her. She stared at the LED screen and begged the elevator to move faster. Just then, she heard the ding of the executive elevator, then Jack's voice. Maria, join us. Nancy shook her head. No, I don't want to impose. I can wait. She smiled anxiously and saw Jonathan glance down at his watch. Jack smirked back at her. If you want to be late, then suit yourself. Nancy hesitated, then dashed into the executive elevator just as the doors closed. She pressed the button on the 36th floor when Jack suddenly selected the 5th. I just remembered I need to hop off on 5. Sorry, everybody. The elevator quickly reached the 5th floor, and Jack disembarked. When the elevator resumed upward, it was so quiet she could hear their breathing. It was the first time Nancy and Jonathan had seen or spoken to each other since Olivia's funeral. She felt increasingly anxious, fixated on the LED screen, as Jonathan observed her intently. The elevator remained suffocatingly silent until another ding told her she'd arrived. Nancy hurried out, and the door slowly closed behind her. Emma waved her into the conference room and whispered urgently, What took you so long? Don't worry about it. Nancy plopped down in a seat and glanced up at the clock, just as the time switched from 8:59 to 9. The meeting commenced, and she was soon called to the front to introduce her hypothesis about a problem with the department's driver prediction algorithm. Just as she started to get in the flow, the door opened, and Jonathan and Steve strode in with their assistants. The room's collegial atmosphere immediately evaporated, and everyone sat up straight. Some of the people who had been waiting to speak put their hands down, but Jonathan immediately called on them, firing off incisive questions and rebuttals. Nancy glanced at Jonathan from the front of the room, irritation simmering at the way he had taken over an otherwise productive meeting. Like always, he was utterly oblivious to the disruption he'd caused. Just as she caught herself glaring at him, his gaze snapped at her. And what do our bright university students think about that? He gestured to Nancy, and a cruel grin flashed across his face. You first. Enlighten us. Nancy panicked. She'd been so busy cursing Jonathan in her head that she lost track of the conversation. She knew she was smart enough to speak on any subject in this meeting, but all she could do was stammer. She could feel the sweat forming on her brow as Jonathan leaned in, grinning from ear to ear. What's your name again? Mary? The blood rushed to her face, and she thought she might explode, when suddenly, an unexpected voice came to her rescue. Nancy's breath hung in her throat as an unexpected voice cut in. Don't be modest, Maria. We know how talented you are. Tell us your thoughts on the impact driverless car will have on the traditional automotive industry. Nancy glanced up. It was Steve who had come to her rescue. She exhaled a sigh of relief and quickly organized her thoughts. When her answer finally came, it was poised, detailed, and engrossing. Multiple team members took notes, and hums of interest rang out all around the table. When she finished speaking, she glanced around the table and noticed just how impressed her colleagues were. As she began to sit down, Jonathan chimed back in. Your perspective is very insightful, but remember to stay focused during meetings. Irked, Nancy lowered her eyes and replied curtly. Understood, Mr. Davis. The meeting continued for 2 more intense hours, and when it finally concluded, Nancy and Emma made their way back to the AI building. At noon, Nancy was preparing to visit the employee cafeteria when she received an unexpected call from Jack. Maria, the CEO summons you to the 36th floor, in his personal office. Nancy's face pinched with stress as she hung up, and Emma clocked it. Are you constipated, or did you just find out your parents died? Nancy laughed and shrugged it off. It was nothing. Peter just wants to see me over lunch. Uh-oh. You think it's about the meeting this morning? If I survived being grilled by Jonathan, I think I can handle Peter. I'm sorry. Since when are you on a first-name basis with the all-powerful Jonathan Davis? Nancy flinched, realizing her mistake. I'm not. I don't know why I said that. Just nerves, I guess. As Nancy walked off, Emma stood with a grin and shouted to the whole office. Dead girl walking. Nancy rolled her eyes and kept going. After a 10-minute walk and a long elevator ride, Nancy approached Jonathan's office. It was lunchtime, and all the secretaries were away, so Jack escorted her into Jonathan's office himself. When he shut the door behind her, she looked around in awe. It was spacious, bright, and opulent, with a large oak desk, a wall dominated by bookshelves, a plush gray sofa, and a marble coffee table. An adjoining lounge was visible through frosted glass, but its door was closed. Nancy stepped over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and her jaw dropped at the breathtaking view of Manhattan. No wonder Jonathan acted like a king. From this perspective, it was easy to feel like one. Just then, the door opened and Jonathan entered, setting a box of food on the coffee table. His demeanor was businesslike, which made his chiseled face look sharper than a blade of steel. He gestured to the sofa across the room. Sit. Nancy nodded, her rigid posture and stoic expression masking her inner tumult. Jonathan sat down across the coffee table from her and crossed his legs. Maria, There's a crucial matter we need to discuss." His grave expression caused Nancy's heart to plummet. She couldn't help but recall Emma's taunts and Jonathan's admonishment earlier in the day. Had he really brought her up here to punish her a second time? Nancy's breaths grew shallow as Jonathan continued. "I've spent days reflecting on our situation. I've always been the one to take the initiative with you, and though I'd hope you would eventually return the favor, I shouldn't have come to expect it. You never made any promises to me, so you're under no obligation to explain everything that happened over the last few weeks." Nancy's fingers curled up tightly as she looked at Jonathan. Regret, anger, and sadness played across his face in equal measure, and it appeared he had reached his breaking point. A dull ache unexpectedly formed in her heart, and a feeling of emptiness rose and caught in her throat. Jonathan's voice grew more and more intense. "What I see now is that you not trusting me is my own fault, and that you'll give me an explanation when I deserve them, not when I demand them. I respect that about you." Nancy's brain lit up with surprise and confusion, but she tried not to show it as Jonathan carried on. "I shouldn't have taken my frustrations out on you, or expected you to read my mind." He locked his eyes with her. "I'm sorry, Maria. This situation was my fault." Nancy was stunned. Was Jonathan actually apologizing? He grasped her hand with determination. "Tell me, what can I do to earn your trust? I'll move mountains for you, carve out oceans, whatever it takes." Nancy studied his sincere expression, and his words echoed in her mind. For perhaps the first time, she felt in her heart that he was being completely honest with her. His sudden openness made her want to give him another chance. Nancy hesitated before speaking, her voice soft. "Actually, I have a problem too. I've always had difficulty letting people in. I don't trust people easily, and that isn't your fault." Jonathan's eyes brightened before narrowing, his tone resolute. "If you and I are going to continue being together, I can't accept you being with Steve any longer. But if you two really love each other, then Nancy interrupted him, blurting out. "Running into Steve on that flight to Chicago was a coincidence. I was exhausted from the tournament and fell asleep before I knew what was happening. All I remember is that I drifted off. There was something about his presence that felt familiar. I thought—" Jonathan's eyes widened in realization, and he couldn't hide his excitement. He leaned closer to Nancy, his voice a heated whisper. "You thought he was me, because it was my scent." Nancy averted her gaze, focusing on the food box and attempting to change the subject. "Speaking of which, what's for lunch? Smells delicious." Jonathan stood, circled the table, and loomed over Nancy, his voice filled with intensity. "Maria, that day you fell asleep on Steve, he was wearing my clothes. You thought he was me, and that's why you wrapped your arms around him." Nancy felt her face flush and her heart race. Even though she'd lived 2 lives, this was her first serious relationship, and it unnerved her that Jonathan could read her thoughts so easily. Suddenly feeling defensive, her gaze hardened, and she looked up at him accusatorily. "Did you take that woman home from the Diamond Club, or were you just testing me? Oh wait, there's no right answer." "You actually saw that." Jonathan's eyes sparkled with delight as he closed in on her, trapping her between him and the sofa, his voice playful yet intense. My, is Maria feeling jealous?" Nancy locked eyes with him, his teasing gaze sending a tidal wave of heat across her face. She gripped the sofa, her throat suddenly parched. "Which is it then? Are you a cheater or just deceitful?" Seeing her flustered, Jonathan grinned and eased up. He grabbed his phone and made a call. "Rose, I need to see you in my office this afternoon." He hung up and sauntered back to Nancy. "She's my niece. You'll meet her later." Nancy huffed, irritated with Jonathan, but aware that she had unfairly assumed the worst about him and never bothered to ask. Jonathan sat next to her and wrapped her in a hug. "So, is my little intern done being angry with her favorite boss?" Nancy wriggled in his grasp, but only ended up being held tighter. She inhaled his familiar scent and heard his warm laugh, and before long, she found herself joining in. He really did have a way of getting to her. At last, Jonathan released her and opened the food box. "Maria, let's feast." Inside there were 3 tiers of fresh seafood, still packaged in glistening ice. Nancy marveled. "Do you always eat like this?" "If it pleases you, we can eat like this every day." Nancy shook her head. "This must have cost more than my paycheck." "Not for long if you keep bringing the kind of analysis you rattled off at the meeting this morning." Nancy blushed. "No thanks to you. It was a test, and I knew you'd pass. Now everyone thinks you're brilliant and unflappable." Nancy dug in and found her appetite was insatiable. Together, they nearly polished off the entire feast. She patted her full stomach. "If I eat like this every day, I'll explode." "You'll always be irresistible to me." "I mean literally. You'll be cleaning my guts off your fancy couch." "If you're that full, then maybe we can think of something else to have for dessert." Jonathan lifted her chin and captured her lips in a passionate kiss. Nancy's breathing grew heavy, and their heartbeats raced in unison as she surrendered to the overwhelming sensation. The thought crossed her mind that she shouldn't have reconciled with him so easily, but his hunger for her was intoxicating, and his hands drifted across her skin like a warm breeze. She melted into his arms. Undoing the top button of her shirt, he pressed his lips against her skin, his touch as tender as a falling petal. Sunlight bathed her body through the windows, and with every fervent kiss, her clothes seemed to slip further from her shoulders, as if they too were being seduced by his touch. Suddenly, a knock on the door shattered the moment. "Jonathan, are you in there?" Steve's voice echoed through the room, and Nancy thought her heart might beat out of her chest. She tried to push Jonathan away, but instead, he scooped her up and carried her into the lounge. He gently placed her on the bed and whispered, "Stay here, my love." Then he swiftly exited, closing the door behind him. Nancy lay on the bed panting, her clothes still disheveled from their passionate encounter. Outside, she heard Steve enter the room and begin talking to Jonathan. She tiptoed toward the door and strained to hear their conversation, when suddenly her phone rang. She quickly silenced it, and when she glanced at the caller ID, she saw it was her older sister, Venus. Nancy cringed as Steve's voice carried into the lounge. "Uncle, is someone in there?" Jonathan was nonchalant. "Of course not. Now tell me more about that financial loophole." Nancy quietly crawled away from the door and texted Venus. "What's up, V? Everything okay?" Venus replied with a news headline that made Nancy's jaw drop. "Chris Miller, president of Miller Enterprises, indicted on 6 felony counts in a blockbuster move by the district attorney. Trial set to begin in a matter of weeks." Nancy's grip on her phone tightened as a whirlwind of emotions swirled through her. Chris had finally met his comeuppance, but she couldn't help worrying how a boy as kind and impressionable as Henry would respond. Whatever happened, she vowed in that moment to take care of him the best she could. Maybe, one day, he and Jacob could even be friends. Suddenly, the door opened and Nancy jumped, but it was just Jonathan. He crossed the bed and wrapped an arm around her. "Let's ditch work." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "Not today. I have something important to do." "All right, my love. Another time." He pinched her cheek, and she stood to leave. Nancy shut the door to Jonathan's office, straightened her clothes, and headed directly for Steve's across the hall. Steve looked up, and his eyes were a mix of surprise and anxiety. "What brings you all the way up here?" He stood and gestured to the sofa. "Please, have a seat." Nancy nodded. "Thank you. We actually need to talk about something important." Nancy crossed toward the couch, but just as she rounded the coffee table, she stepped on a stray coffee spoon, losing her footing, and instinctively grabbed Steve's sleeve. As she fell backwards onto the sofa, Steve came tumbling down directly on top of her. From inches away, their eyes locked in a moment of intense surprise, and both could feel the warmth of the other on their lips. Nancy and Steve were on top of each other on the couch, frozen in shock. Steve suddenly tried to get himself up, but Nancy stopped him. "Don't get up." He looked at her in disbelief. What do you mean?" She pointed at his chest. "My hair is caught in your tie clip." Steve blushed and leaned back to free her, but she saw him freeze for a brief moment, his eyes wandering over her face. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Before she could parse his feelings, he closed his eyes and moved his face towards hers. Her hand shot up to block his impending kiss, and Steve's lips met the back of her hand. When he realized what he'd done, the atmosphere instantly became charged with tension. Suddenly, Nancy's eyes went wide, and she stared at Steve. You've recovered." "It should be fine." He suddenly blushed and grew awkward. "Congratulations. Now you can free my hair and get off me?" Steve nodded, quickly untangled her hair from his button, and lifted his body off hers. "I'm sorry about that. Just give me one moment, then we'll talk." His face bright red, Steve hustled into his lounge and shut the door behind him. As soon as he heard the door latch, Steve let out a long exhale. His mind was filled with the dreams he'd been having about Maria for the last few weeks. They were so vivid and tender that for the first time, he felt grateful to have her as his girlfriend. When he'd helped her recover in the meeting that morning, he'd actually started to think they could make a great team. She was intelligent, beautiful, and capable. While she could be strong-willed to a fault, she was also infinitely loyal to her friends. She wasn't pretentious, and she always kept him guessing. He couldn't say that for any other woman he'd ever known. As these thoughts settled in Steve's mind, a faint joy blossomed in his heart, and his body finally relaxed. He straightened his clothes and headed for the door. When Steve returned, Nancy couldn't help notice that his voice was suddenly softer. "Before you start, I just want you to know how well you did in that meeting this morning. Jonathan didn't need to be so hard on you, and everyone was very impressed." "Thank you, Steve." Nancy was taken aback by his friendly tone, but tried to remain businesslike. "The reason I wanted to speak with you is to say thank you for all the help you've provided in these past few months." Steve's brows furrowed. "I also owe you an apology. I used your insecurity to manipulate you into cooperating with me, and I feel terrible for the pain that it must have caused you." Steve's eyes grew cold, as if he could see the avalanche coming, but he knew he couldn't stop it. Nancy's voice trembled slightly. "I'm thrilled that your problem seems to have resolved itself, but coincidentally, mine has too." Steve interrupted her, his voice terse. "Skip the formalities. What exactly are you trying to say?" "I'm freeing you from your end of the contract. From now on, we don't need to pretend we're a couple, and I'll never say anything to harm your reputation. I'm not famous, so there's no need for me to clarify anything with the press. But you're different. If you don't end our arrangement with an official announcement, it might affect your future relationships. You can tell them you broke up with me." Steve suddenly stood up, cutting her off. "You don't have to concern yourself with my future relationships." His voice was icy, and his eyes were narrow with rage. She was baffled by his sudden anger, but stayed cool. "We're in agreement then?" "What? Did you think I'd refuse if you wanted to stop blackmailing me? You were nothing to me, Maria. Less than nothing, and you always have been. If I never see you again, it will be too soon." Nancy tried to remain stoic, but Steve's callousness wounded her. "Fine. It's settled then. We've broken up." Maria stood up to leave, but Steve cut her off with his body. He pointed at her and sneered. "Maria, listen carefully. There's no breakup because we were never together. There's only me being rid of a wretched, disgusting leech that I'd be glad to have never met in the first place." Nancy scoffed, pushed past Steve, and stormed out of his office, only to run headlong into one of his secretaries. She had clearly been listening at the door, and Nancy glared at her before charging off. After taking a long walk to clear her head, Nancy had just returned to her workspace and gotten focused when she received another call from Jack, requesting her in Jonathan's office. Things with Steve hadn't gone as smoothly as she had hoped, but she was still excited to share the news with Jonathan. Upon entering his office, Nancy saw a poised young woman sitting on the sofa. The woman stood and greeted Nancy with a beaming smile as Jonathan draped his arm around Nancy's shoulder. Maria, meet Rose. Her father and my late brother were like brothers themselves, so I've always known her as my niece. Nancy smiled warmly, and Rose extended her hand. Hi, Miss Miller. Uncle Jay has told me so much about you. Nancy nearly choked. I'm sorry, Miss Miller? You can just call me Maria. How old are you anyway? Rose smiled. Almost 20. I'm in my second year at NYU. I'm only 1 year older than you and you call me Miss? Uncle Jay said I had to because he's my uncle and you're with him. Well, sometimes Uncle Jay is full of Jonathan cut her off. Hey now, just trying to instill a little respect in the younger generation. We're in the same generation. You get my point. Rose's jaw dropped at the sight of Nancy giving Jonathan so much crap. Ooh, I like her. Nancy glanced slyly at Jonathan, who walked over and ruffled Rose's hair. I like her too. And hey, if I'm ever busy, there's no reason you two can't hang out. Rose here is a great workout partner. She may look young, but she's fearless. Even gives me a run for my money every time we spar together. I've never seen anyone beat on you the way she just did. Maybe between the two of us, we could actually take you down. Jonathan smirked. I'll believe it when I see it. Rose turned to Nancy. Train with me long enough, and I guarantee you'll be able to land a shoulder throw on him. Deal, Nancy laughed, and marveled at how instantly endearing the girl in front of her was. Rose's vivacious spirit and fearlessness reminded her of Esther, and she hoped that one day they would be able to meet. Rose soon left for an appointment, and as the door shut behind her, Jonathan pulled Nancy into his arms. So, Miss Miller isn't jealous anymore? Nancy stomped on his foot. I never was. Of course not. My big, strong Maria would never be jealous. Jonathan paused deliberately before adding, she just doesn't want me to speak to other women. Nancy started to respond, but Jonathan silenced her with a passionate kiss. He lifted her onto the sofa, and she was soon enveloped by the plush cushions. He took advantage of the situation, pressing down on her and deepening the kiss, his hands venturing beneath her clothes. As things escalated, Nancy felt the heat between them intensify, and a nagging thought entered her mind. Here they were, in the middle of a workday, and this hugely powerful CEO could seemingly think of nothing but sex. He was so passionate and attentive with her now, but what would happen when he got what he wanted? After all, she wasn't like all the other women who fawned over him. She had rejected him time and again. How could she know she wasn't just an exciting challenge, and once he had conquered her, he would cast her aside? She had countless friends who thought they were in strong relationships, until one day their boyfriend just got bored. She pulled away from him and blurted out a question. Do you only just want to sleep with me? He moved closer to her ear and whispered seductively. Maria, I don't just want to sleep with you. I crave your presence, night and day. We can even sleep during the day. Forget the companies, forget our families. I just want to be wrapped around you every moment until our bodies turn to dust. As she listened, Nancy's tangled emotions shifted from confusion to embarrassment to anger. Jonathan, can you be serious for once? He chuckled. Who can be serious when they're in front of the woman they're madly in love with? He captured her lips in a passionate kiss. Maria, I've been waiting for you to come work here since the day we met. The bed in my lounge has been so lonely. Nancy playfully punched him a few times before squirming out from underneath him and straightening her clothes. Show me you love me for more than just my body, or it's going to be lonelier for a hell of a lot longer. With that, she hustled out of his office. Back at her computer, Nancy rubbed her slightly swollen lips, and a tornado of emotions swirled within her. She couldn't deny that she wanted him, but she refused to be his toy. And her difficulty with trusting people had made it that much harder for her to express herself. She hadn't even told him that she'd broken up with Steve. She just traded barbs with him and stormed out. She opened an online forum and posted, Why am I so bad at expressing my feelings? Am I undateable? For the rest of the week, Jonathan found excuses to call her over almost every day, resulting in lavish meals and increasingly intense physical encounters that always left her uneasy about what she meant to him. Back at her dorm one night, Nancy remembered her post on the forum and checked the replies. There were dozens, but one in particular struck a chord. Sometimes, people act distant in a relationship, not out of lack of feeling, but out of a surplus of it. They allow their fear of getting hurt to keep them locked in a cage, as if admitting their love would mean giving away a part of themselves they could never get back. But that's not how love works. It can't be quantified or measured, and it often flows in directions we can't predict, and that's what makes it beautiful. And don't forget, poster, you can't truly love someone else until you love yourself. Nancy wiped a tear from her cheek. Her past had damaged her so profoundly that she wasn't sure she would be able to love unconditionally again. As for loving herself, how could she? The face she saw when she looked in the mirror wasn't even her own. As she sunk into a deep pit of loneliness, it suddenly occurred to her that the reason she could never accept Jonathan's love was that he had no idea who she actually was. Despite her many visits to Jonathan's office, Nancy hadn't seen Steve since the day she broke up with him. News of their split seemed to be spreading like wildfire throughout the company, and though she'd overheard plenty of false gossip about it, she remained indifferent, until an invitation arrived from her stepmother, Sophia. Sophia hosted extravagant banquets at her home in the Hamptons every 2 months, and her last one resulted in Jonathan helping her upstage Chloe before nearly exposing their relationship at dinner. All that baggage made Nancy reluctant to attend, but she felt compelled to inform Sophia about her breakup with Steve and return the lavish gift she'd received from her when they first met. The gathering was planned for the coming weekend, so Jonathan arranged for a driver and promised he'd arrive separately. Nancy arrived as the party was finally filling, and she captivated everyone's attention when she entered the party in a breathtaking sapphire blue gown. She spotted Jonathan charming the guests and walked over. But conscious of the need to protect both her reputation and Steve's pride, she smiled softly. "Mr. Davis, nice to see you again." Jonathan returned her smile. "The pleasure is all mine. My sister is inside. You can go on in." As Nancy turned to enter, another car pulled up, and Kim stepped out with her father. "Jonathan!" Kim beamed at him, and her voice was sugary sweet. After greeting Jonathan, she turned to Nancy. "Oh, Maria, hello." Nancy nodded and forced a smile. "Hello, Kim." Jonathan dived into conversation with Kim's father, leaving Nancy to enter the party alone. Finding Sophia standing by herself, Nancy rushed over in hopes of getting their conversation over with as soon as possible. "Hi, Mrs. Davis. Thank you so much for inviting me." Sophia replied warmly. "Of course, my dear. You and Steve really do need to visit more often. This big house gets lonely." Nancy hesitated, her lips trembling. "I actually wanted to talk to you about Steve." Suddenly, a female voice interrupted. "Sophia!" Chloe swept in wearing a long, mysterious black dress that made her look both elegant and dangerous. She greeted Nancy with a cunning smile and quickly engaged Sophia in conversation. "How is it possible that you look younger every time I see you?" "Always a charmer, Chloe. Say, did I show you my newest piece in the gallery?" As Sophia led her off, Chloe turned to Nancy and winked. Nancy sighed at the cruel irony of Chloe outmaneuvering her in the very moment she was going to tell Sophia about her breakup with Steve. Nonetheless, she'd have to wait for another opportunity. Nancy retreated to a quiet sitting area, hoping to avoid conversation until she could speak to Sophia and make a quiet exit. She sank into a plush sofa, separated from the rest of the room by a large green shrub, and no sooner had she sat down than 2 young women approached, deep in an intimate conversation. She quickly recognized both voices. The younger one was Jonathan's niece, Katie, and the older one was none other than Kim. Katie spoke excitedly. "Kim, should I start calling you Aunt soon? I saw Uncle Jonathan talking to your dad. They must be discussing your marriage." Kim's cheeks flushed. Don't be ridiculous, Katie. Jonathan and I have known each other for years. There's nothing going on. Just admit it. Katie's voice was full of mischief. We all know you have a thing for him. Every year on his birthday, you make him such elaborate gifts. I remember one year you were too sick to make him anything, so you snuck into the kitchen to cook for him and fainted halfway through. Kim grew anxious, her voice shaking. Don't spread rumors. The last thing I need is for someone to overhear you and go running to Jonathan. Katie narrowed her eyes defiantly. Why not? If you don't tell him now, he'll never know how you feel. Besides, he obviously doesn't have anyone else. He's probably just being a gentleman and waiting for you to give him a sign. Think about the last time you were in the hospital. He was there longer than anyone. Kim hesitated for a moment, her voice barely a whisper. Katie, you're too young to understand. My health is poor. The doctor said he has no idea how long I have left. I'm not worthy of him. What do those doctors know anyway? First they say you won't live past 15, then they say you won't live past 20. Now you're 23. None of that matters. Jonathan has only ever seen me as his sick, fragile sister. Tears welled up in her eyes, her voice breaking. It's so unfair. If only I could be as healthy as her. So you admit it then. Kim gazed at Katie, her voice filled with emotion now. It sounds stupid, but I've loved him since we were little kids. There was this time he beat up a kid that was bullying me because of my crutches. No one had ever stood up for me before. He was like my knight in shining armor. Kim's voice trembled, her emotions raw. If I were healthy, if there were any chance for us to have a future together, I would tell him how I feel. It's been my dream for so long, but I can't give him anything. I can only hold him back. I realized long ago that if I really loved him, I had to free him of that burden. That's why I've always referred to him as a brother. On the other side of the shrub, Nancy listened to Kim's confession with a mix of sadness and indignation. She had been right all along, yet she took no joy in Kim's suffering. Nancy noticed Kim's tone shift back to defiance. Listen to me, Katie. You can never say a word about this. Not to anyone. Do you promise? Fine. But when you two have your wedding, I'm going to say I told you so. As Kim and Katie wandered off to grab drinks, Nancy let out a deep sigh. This was just one more reason to be nervous about Jonathan's commitment to her. Was it so impossible to imagine that he and Kim felt the same way about each other and had simply never told anyone? Just then, Nancy saw Sophia standing alone and seized her opportunity, running over with the gift she intended to return. Sophia, can we talk? I actually have something important to tell you. Sophia gazed back at her, and Nancy handed her the box. I can't accept this, Mrs. Davis. Steve and I... Sophia's eyes went wide, and she interrupted. Why not? What are you saying? As she spoke, she spotted Steve nearby and called him over. Steve, have you been mistreating Maria? Is this about Chloe? Steve turned his gaze to Nancy and narrowed his eyes with fury. You told my mother I mistreated you? Of course not. She turned to Sophia. I'm glad he's here, because we can't keep this from you and your family any longer. She paused, noticing that their conversation had gathered a number of eavesdroppers. She wanted everyone to know, so she spoke a little louder. Steve and I have decided to end our relationship. The breakup was amicable. It just wasn't meant to be. She put the box in Sophia's hand. That's why I can't accept this. Sophia turned to Steve. You agree that it wasn't meant to be? Steve managed to growl a yes, then glared at Nancy, spun around, and stormed off. Sophia watched her son's icy exit and sighed deeply. He's always been like this. Don't take it to heart. I'll have a word with him. No need. Nancy's voice was gentle, and a sad smile graced her lips. Both people need to be happy for a relationship to work. We thought about it for a long time, and I'm certain it's the right thing for both of us. Steve will find somebody perfect. I know it. Seeing Nancy's resolve, Sophia reluctantly accepted her decision. Very well. I hope you won't be a stranger. Good night, Maria." As Sophia walked off, Nancy sighed in relief and turned to leave. But as she made her way through the house, she heard a scornful voice ring out behind her. "Well, well, well. Look who it is. How does it feel having Steve cut you back down to size? And he made you return that gift in front of everyone? Tragic." Nancy spun around to see the group of Chloe's friends who tried to frame her for ruining the counterfeit handbag the first time she met Sophia. Their expressions dripped with smug disdain as a third one chimed in. "You guys didn't hear that? Her dad is going to prison and the courts are taking everything. Why would Steve want anything to do with that? Plus, Chloe and Steve are childhood sweethearts. They've been in love for 10 years. Having heard enough childhood sweetheart stories for one night, Nancy scowled and a dark glint flashed in her eyes. "Let me guess. You guys are groveling at her feet because she promised that you all will become her personal lapdogs when she marries into the Davis family? Uh-oh, here she comes. You better do a good trick for her or she won't leave you treats." As Chloe's friends all reacted with disgusted scoffs, Steve and Chloe approached, arm in arm. The girl's eyes shone with pride, and Nancy locked eyes with Steve, a sarcastic smile playing on her lips. Chloe, ever graceful, smiled warmly at Nancy. "Oh, hi, Maria. I didn't think you were still here. What are you all discussing?" One of the girls quickly chimed in. "We were talking about how perfect you and Steve look together. A match made in heaven. Heaven currently sounds better than prison." Pretending to be upset, Chloe turned to Steve. "They love to gossip. Don't mind them." "I don't mind at all. In fact, I happen to agree." Steve spoke to Chloe, but his gaze was still fixed on Nancy. "What do you think?" Nancy glanced back at Steve and nodded, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I think I'd rather be in prison alone than in heaven with you. Enjoy your evening." With that, Nancy spun to leave, but unbeknownst to her, there was an impeccably dressed woman sipping wine right behind her. She and Nancy collided, and the wine splashed out from her glass and all over the rug. Nancy groaned. "Can anyone in this house hold on to their wine? Pas de moi." The woman launched into a furious tirade in French, and the girls who had taunted Nancy earlier watched with malicious glee. Nancy prepared to storm off, but suddenly realized who was yelling at her. This was no ordinary Frenchwoman. It was Maxime Dier, a world-famous jewelry designer. Nancy knew about her because she had once collaborated with Esther on a Y&P handbag and an accompanying brooch, creating a huge hit for both brands. It occurred to Nancy that this woman might just have some information about Esther. Before Nancy could speak, Chloe inserted herself in perfect French. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Dier. This woman is a clumsy horse with terrible taste. Please try to forgive her." All the girls snickered, and another crowd gathered, including both Jonathan and Steve. A wicked smile crossed Nancy's lips, because once again, she had the upper hand. Shocking everyone with her own immaculate French, she stepped in front of Chloe. "I'm sorry that my exuberance caused you to spill your wine, Maxime. May I call you Maxime? What my inbred friend here doesn't realize is that you're wearing a one-of-a-kind brooch designed by your one-time collaborator, Sabrina. I happen to be one of the world's leading experts on her work, and I would love to speak with you about it." Everyone in the room stared at Nancy, speechless, and a wry smile broke out across Maxime's face.